Summer is the season for medical students to be on their sub-Is or acting internships, or even doing away rotations at different institutions that they can see themselves going to in the future for residency. And this episode was inspired by one particular medical student that I worked with during my first month of fellowship, and one of my friends from UVM who's actually here in Boston doing an away rotation in surgery in the hopes of matching in Boston in his future. Over my time during residency and even this year, and even back in my time as a medical student, I've kind of been able to observe different attributes and qualities that I think make for a good med student and for an experience that I think would provide you ample opportunity to shine and show off who you are in front of an attending and potentially land you a spot in that residency program. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about my own experience as a medical student doing an away rotation and 3 qualities that I think can really make you stand out and crush your acting internships. Welcome to episode 2 of CMO, and hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to Collecting My Observations. Enter into the stream of thoughts that flow through the mind of an ICU fellow who is on his way to becoming an anesthesiologist and intensivist. This is where patients live on the verge of life and death.
So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge just how hard it is to be a medical student. You go from basically the most excitement you may have ever had in your life of getting into medical school to basically being overwhelmed by how little you know and how quickly you need to learn all of this information in order to just keep up with some of the smartest people in the room that make you feel like an inferior version of yourself. Even though you clearly are someone who's worthwhile enough to get into medical school, everyone I think suffers from a little bit of imposter syndrome, especially when you're surrounded by brilliant minds who also got themselves into this position. Not only do you have to go through the process of gaining all of this information in a short amount of time, you're then tested under brutal conditions, like sitting in front of a computer for 8 to 9 hours, having to learn complex words that have a lot of Latin in them and barely resemble English words. And then all of a sudden you jump into these rotations where you're surrounded by experienced professionals and medical healthcare providers who just seem to get medicine so easily and just can flow through all of these diagnoses and their workflow so much smoother than you could ever anticipate yourself ever doing. Now, compound that with wanting to impress the people that you're working with in the hopes that they may hire you in the future. Makes for a pretty stressful time. And what I found was when you're kind of an average student for test scores and exam scores, really what you want to do to make yourself the best possible candidate for residency is impress your attendings and your residents when you're on rotation so that hopefully you get good clerkship grades, but also you get good letters of recommendations that can help paint who you are as a person when your potential employee is looking to basically match you to their program. Now, when I was a medical student getting ready to apply to residency, I had pretty average board scores, and at the time, anesthesia wasn't that competitive, at least compared to how competitive it is these days. I was actually just reading the ASA monitor last night with my wife, and the headlines were basically all about how anesthesiology has become one of the most competitive specialties to get into. But at the time that I applied in 2019, it was not nearly as competitive, and I probably consider myself a little lucky to have gotten in the first place. But at that time, I thought I could bolster my application by doing an away rotation. So I signed up to do one in New York City and found myself an opportunity to go to Mount Sinai for a month. Now, this experience of doing an away rotation is quite the story and is about as New York City, I think, as you can possibly get. It starts in kind of a really dark down place and ends up being a really positive and awesome experience in the long run. So let's just get into that story. So around July and August, I find out that I am basically accepted to Mount Sinai's away rotation to do an acting internship in their anesthesia department. So I go on rotatingroom.com and I find this apartment that looks pretty nice. It's a one bedroom, has its own bathroom, pretty reasonably priced. I reach out to this person. We negotiate contract and payment, and ultimately we come to a conclusion that that's going to be where I'm staying for that month. So I emailed this person on a Friday, basically telling them what time I anticipate coming in and asking where I could find the keys, and it's radio silence that whole weekend. And I wake up Sunday knowing that I'm expected to be at Mount Sinai working on Monday, and I decide to just drive to New York City with really no certainty as to what to expect in terms of my housing situation, but knowing that I kind of had family nearby in upstate New York. There was also Penn State alumni who was at Mount Sinai doing his intern year. So I kind of had a little bit of a safety net in terms of this whole housing situation not working out. You could probably guess where the story's going. I show up to New York City around 6 o'clock in the evening. Sun is starting to go down, and I'm looking for this apartment number. And I'm driving down the street, and there's apartment numbers on one side of this apartment number, and then skips that apartment number, and then the numbers continue down the block. And I probably drove up and down the street 2 or 3 times until I finally realized that this address did not exist. So I had to quickly scramble and figure out where I was going to sleep that night. So I texted the Penn State alumni who was an intern at Mount Sinai. Luckily, he reached back out to me and invited me to stay over at his house for the night. He set up an air mattress for me in his living room, and I pretty much left all of my stuff in my car, parked it outside of his apartment, and then went to Mount Sinai the next day. Once I got to Mount Sinai, it was kind of just like an orientation day, and then I explained to them my housing situation / crisis, and they basically told me to just take the day to just figure that out. Ultimately, I found myself in Starbucks feeling like a homeless person in New York City because that was the only place I could find Wi-Fi, and I was just frantically looking for another place to live. Another lucky situation at the time was a fellow classmate of mine at Penn State was also doing an away rotation at Mount Sinai in plastic surgery. She had been living in the Queens area with a family member, but had found a friend who was living in the Upper East Side who she was going to move and live in with during her away rotation at Mount Sinai. But she knew what my situation was and offered to send this person's contact info to me so that I would have a place to stay. And this kind classmate and friend of mine basically sacrificed her ability to live nearby the hospital and ended up staying in Queens that whole month and probably had much worse hours than me. But she really hooked me up in that situation. So I reach out to this contact that I get from my classmate, and I end up finding an awesome roommate. This happened after about 2 or 3 nights of spending my evenings and nights on an air mattress at the Penn State alumni's house / living room. And eventually he told me that his parents were coming that weekend and I was going to need to get out of his house. So the timing couldn't have worked out better. The roommate that I ended up with ended up being an awesome girl. She was a waitress in New York City and also an actress in New York City. She was able to show me all the cool spots in the Upper East Side, was even able to get me and my fiance at the time, who's now my wife, tickets to Hamilton. This was all in the efforts of me trying to show my wife a good time in New York City and convince her that this was potentially going to be a great spot for me to do residency. But ultimately, it was a group decision on both of our parts that New York City was not going to be in the cards in our future. However, back to the rotation itself. So I ended up being paired with the program director at Mount Sinai for the entire month. And he was considered one of the ENT specialists for the anesthesia department. So majority of the days that I had there was in their ENT section of the ORs, which meant pretty intense cases from a surgical perspective, but also from a anesthetic perspective. Now, this program director was a very cool guy. I remember one of the first impressions I got of him was when they were doing a timeout before the surgery was beginning, and somebody, I believe it was a circulating nurse in the room, had said, "Anesthesia, can you do your part of the timeout?" And he basically just flipped out on that person and was just like, "We are not anesthesia. You should know us by our names, and you will no longer refer to us as anesthesia. You will refer to my resident by their name." And in that moment, I was like, I have never seen this type of attitude at Penn State or from any other attendings, where they just defend their resident with so much energy and so much pride in who they are as people, that it was really remarkable to see and kind of inspired me to want to go to Mount Sinai. But ultimately, this is how I saw this person's character play out the whole month. He really cared about the residency program. He really cared about the residents, and he wanted to make sure everybody had good training and was respected and treated well throughout their time there. So during my time there, I was able to do all of the usual stuff like intubate, talk about different medications. You know, when the resident would go out on their breaks, I would stay in the room and just kind of chat with the program director. And we really got to know each other over that time. There was a couple moments I think that really stuck out clinically that I think left an impression in his head. One was sinking a 14 gauge IV in this guy's wrist or forearm. And I remember he was super pumped about that. And then the second situation was a person who had neck cancer and needed a fiber optic intubation. And he basically said to me, you know, you're with the senior resident. The senior resident can basically decide if they want to do the bronch or you can do the fiber optic intubation. And luckily the CA3 or senior resident I was with was going into chronic pain. And he was like, dude, I've had enough of these intubations. Like, it's all yours. And so I probably had only had my hands on the bronchoscope maybe once or twice before this situation. But somehow, some way, I was super lucky that day and had a very smooth fiber optic intubation around this large cancer right in the back of this person's mouth. And literally right after that happened, I looked at the attending, his jaw was dropped to the ground, and he invited me to the graduation party that on the spot. And in that moment, I kind of felt like I had made it. Ultimately, that rotation ended with me going to the graduation party, making friends with some of the residents at that residency program, and ultimately getting a letter of recommendation from the program director. He pretty much told me if I wanted to come to New York City and Mount Sinai, there would be a spot for me. And if he needed to make any connections for me at other hospitals, because that's where my life was going to take me, he'd be more than happy to do that as well. And that was, again, something that stuck with me, because he didn't push me to come to his residency program, but he valued me enough as a person to say, even if you don't want to come here, I'm willing to vouch for you as a person, as a future resident to any other residency program. And ultimately, that's kind of how my interview went with him when it was time to interview at Mount Sinai. I sat down in his office and he said, "Kenny, are you coming to Mount Sinai or are you not coming to Mount Sinai?" And that's when I had to break the news to him that my wife and I had talked and we didn't see New York City in our future, but that he would be high up on my rank list. And we basically talked about what the rest of my rank list looked like. He offered to make some phone calls with me. But ultimately, I ended up at Brown, and we kept in touch throughout my residency training. Okay, well, that's enough about me. I'm going to talk about the 3 qualities that I think make for a good medical student. The first one is pretty simple and pretty straightforward, as long as it comes intuitive to you, which hopefully this comes pretty intuitive for most people. But that's just being punctual. And with being punctual, the ability to independently manage yourself, being able to figure out where the bathroom is on your own, or being able to not have to ask permission to go to the bathroom, or just being able to pick up on social cues of when you should be talking or when you shouldn't be talking. Hopefully those all come naturally and intuitive to most people. but you'd be surprised how often you see it doesn't come naturally. But starting with just being punctual and knowing where to show up is a great place to start. Doing a little bit of homework ahead of time, especially if it's an institution you're not familiar with, to figure out where your walking directions are going to be, giving yourself a little extra time in the morning to allow yourself to get lost or anticipate that you might need a little extra time to get to your ultimate location. Those will all set you up in a way to not show up late, especially when you're coming to an ICU setting, which I'm basically going to be focusing on what a good medical student in the ICU would look like. But showing up to an ICU setting where there's a whole team of residents and an attending, and then here you are as the lowly medical student coming in late and timid and embarrassed at this point. So if you can have the forethought to give yourself a little bit of extra time, especially on your first day, but probably most days and really every day that you're on this acting internship, to be early and at least be on time so that you're not panicked and you're not coming in stressed out to the situation. If anything, showing up early gives you enough time to read up on your patients and do a little bit of homework before the rest of the team gets there. Because as a medical student, you just digest information a little bit slower than your residents because you just don't have the experience. You haven't had the time to see the pattern recognition, know what's important, know what's not important. And ultimately, you're going to be gathering all of the data. And your job is to make sure you don't miss anything. So giving yourself enough time to be thorough, to investigate all of the data, talk to the nighttime nurses, maybe even listen to their handoff with the daytime nurses so that you can get a sense as to what they thought were important overnight events. Those are all ways that you can take advantage of showing up early and being on time and punctual. Being punctual also proves that you're going to be a reliable resident to that attending that you're working with. And being someone who's reliable is something that's very crucial in an ICU setting. The second quality that I think plays very well for medical students is when you're engaged and an engaged member of the team. The best way to do this is to pick up interesting patients that are on the service. Some of the most interesting patients are going to be new admissions to the ICU because we as a team have to do all of the diagnostic work to figure out what's going on with this patient. A lot of time patients come to the ICU in what we call undifferentiated shock, meaning that they clearly have signs of end organ damage and low blood pressure, hypoperfusion, but we may not know what's driving that low blood pressure, and there'll need to be a broad workup to figure out why they're acting so sick. And proving yourself as a medical student to gather all of the relevant information and synthesize a plan while also performing physical exams and understanding which lab findings are important in complicated, undifferentiated patients. Even if you're not totally spot on or you sound like you're questioning your plan as you're talking about it, at least having the guts and the capacity to try something like this and push yourself out of your comfort zone is going to be recognized, and by the right people will be respected. Now, ideally, you're going to keep up with this patient throughout their time in the ICU, and you will be able to claim this patient kind of as your own patient that you're following during their time in the ICU. Unfortunately, as a medical student, there's few things that you can do from a medical legal perspective in terms of writing notes and doing procedures, but being able to keep up with all of the new data that comes in about patients, all of the new events that are happening on a day-to-day basis, and being able to change your plan and adapt to changes as they come will be recognized as important skills and qualities as a future resident in that program or institution. The other thing that goes along with this engagement is having the appropriate amount of curiosity. So throughout your time with the team, especially when it's your opportunity to talk and present a patient, if you are able to figure out the proper relevant questions for those moments, it'll really make it sound like you are engaged in a way that you're thirsting for a deeper understanding of what's going on with this patient. And it's okay to be honest in terms of what you don't know in a situation. It can be tricky to figure out what's really relevant to ask about. But honestly, if you're a nice person, most people will give you a lot of grace in terms of what questions you ask. But I think if you do enough background research and enough homework, you can probably sound like you know what you're talking about and just be honest about things that don't make 100% sense in your mind. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about, which might be one of the trickiest things to do because sometimes this almost depends on what members are on your team and what personalities are on your team, but somehow you need to figure out how to make yourself personable and memorable. Because if you're looking for a letter of recommendation, you want to be someone who is memorable in that writer's mind. It's somewhat easy to write generic letters of recommendations, and it's, I think, somewhat easy when you're reading letters of recommendation to pick out the ones that are generic and that don't have that much flavor. But if you can make yourself memorable and you can make connections with an attending or just really show off who you are as a person that got you to this position that you're in right now, I think those will really be able to stand out in your letter and hopefully highlight who you are as a person outside of medicine and maybe draw in qualities and attributes that make you a quality person in medicine. For example, if you're working with somebody, maybe one of the easiest things to ask them about is where they're from. If you're lucky, they live nearby where you grew up, or you have some sort of relationship to that location, and that's an easy way to start a conversation that's not about medicine. The next easiest thing that you can talk about, or maybe memorable thing you can talk about, are hobbies outside of medicine. Sports were usually my go-to, but obviously people do a lot of other things outside of sports, like singing, dancing, plays, whatever it is. You obviously have done extracurriculars that have gotten you to this point, and don't be afraid to talk about them because you may not know who will relate to certain extracurriculars that you did. And before you know it, you will be having free-flowing conversations that aren't about medicine and will make you sound and look and appear more like a human being than just a nervous medical student who is trying to impress everybody in the room during their audition rotation. Most people are their own biggest critic, especially when you feel like you're auditioning for a spot. So honestly, if you follow at least 2 or 3 of these things that I brought up, you're going to position yourself to be in a good spot, to be memorable, and to hopefully have, 1, a good experience yourself and feel like you got something out of that rotation, but 2, also feel like you made an impact on the team and left a memory that hopefully will come back up during your interview when you get an interview at that institution. Now, if you say 1 thing dumb or 2 things dumb, most people probably won't remember it, especially if you're going to be there for a whole month. People have short-term memories, and again, you don't risk too much by presenting a patient. It's not like you're doing a procedure that you can really screw up. The worst thing you can do is leave out information that may have been useful in that situation, or misspeak or misread something on the EMR. But you always have residents who also know these patients very well and will back you up. And if you make friends with your residents, they hopefully will be able to tee you up for success and help fill you in on what the important parts are. Maybe you can even talk through your plan with the resident before having to present it in front of the attending. But ideally, if you make friends with the residents, they will help you succeed as well. So to wrap up, if you take nothing else away from this talk, just remember to be yourself. 1, because who you are got you to the position that you are today, which means you got into medical school, you defied the odds of a very small percentage of even getting to that point. You've decided what you want to do in your future. You've been able to secure a spot at an away rotation, or maybe you're just at your own institution doing a sub-I. Regardless, your personality and your knowledge base got you to this position, and you need to trust that this same person is going to get you to your next step. Now, acting internships takes a lot of brain capacity, and just remember, this is a short amount of time in your life. So try and be the best version of yourself every day possible. I know there's a lot of things in life that happen outside of our jobs and outside of medicine, and some of those can leak into our professional lives. But if you can really just throw all of your energy and all of your attention into this short amount of time, I think you will really be able to walk away feeling like you left it all in the court. So just go out there and be the best version of yourselves and have fun. I think if you're having fun, people will recognize that, and it's hard to hate somebody with a smile on their face. If you like this episode of CMO, be sure to hit the subscribe button to the Behind the Drapes podcast, where you can hear more episodes just like this and have the new episodes downloaded to your homepage as they come out. If you want to check out some of the educational content that I put out, check out my social media page on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube, and that's at Keywords by Kenny, at KeywordsXKenny, and that'll get you to these short videos that I put out about different educational topics related to anesthesia and the ICU.